Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Nash. I'm the director of the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies program here at Duke University. It is my immense pleasure and always relief that we have arrived at this day. I'm happy to welcome you to the 18th Annual Feminist Theory Workshop. For 18 years, Duke's Feminist Theory Workshop has hosted leading feminist scholars, including Hortense Spillers, Jasbir Puar, Kevin Quashie, Lauren Berlant, Jennifer Morgan, Patricia J. Williams, Catherine McKittrick, and Christina Crosby. This year, we welcome Nicole Fleetwood, Farah Jasmine Griffin, Sophie Lewis, and Linda Zarilli, and our roundtable participants, Victoria Hasford, Christina Leon, and Rebecca Wanzo. It is such an honor to add their names to the roster of leading scholars who have shared their work with us. From its inception, this gathering has been a workshop, a space for thinking together across field and institution, across discipline and method. It has been a place where the complexities of feminist theories are debated and discussed, where students and faculty collectively engage and at times collectively struggle with feminist and queer theories in their multiplicities and incommensurability. And we've always had our fingers on the tender and complex places where something called feminist theory and something called feminist politics touch. In 2021, because of the pandemic, the Feminist Theory Workshop became a fully hybrid event, which means that what seems to be one conference is actually two conferences unfolding simultaneously, the one in this room and the one online. The virtual Feminist Theory Workshop has allowed more scholars from across the world to access the event while maintaining the workshop format and creating online spaces for scholarly exchange and debate. So I also want to extend a warm welcome to the nearly 400 participants who are accessing FTW online right now. Yep. This year, we meet in a radically changed context. This is a year where the possibility of thinking together and publicly feels all the more urgent and all the more under threat. We meet in a time that can only be described as a crisis for higher education, for democratic institutions, for science, for history, for expertise and evidence, for protest and dissent, and of course for fields like ours, like gender and sexuality studies, and allied fields like Black studies, critical ethnic studies, Asian American studies, and Latinx studies. We see new and unprecedented threats waged against undocumented folks, lawful permanent residents and visa holders. We see activists, dissenters, and protesters silenced, detained, and punished. We see a wholesale and largely successful effort to erase women, queer folks, trans folks, people of color, feminists, dissenters, and activists, not just from the here and now, but also from history. Indeed, we are seeing the past rewritten in real time. Evidence of our gatherings, our organizing, our practices of surviving and life-making, and our very existence are being erased. This is an effort to insist that we were never here. And it is certainly an effort to ensure that we do not make it into the future. To be clear, some of this erasure has been the result of concession. Just a few weeks ago, for example, and this is just one of many examples, when Republicans threatened Muriel Bowser, the mayor of DC, with the loss of millions of dollars of federal funds for the district. Bowser was instructed that the 2-block-long Black Lives Matter mural painted on 16th Street in the summer of 2020 had to be removed if she wanted her funds restored. 3 days ago, the mural was jackhammered off the road. Black Lives Matter Plaza will be renamed, most likely Liberty Plaza. When asked about the destruction of the mural and the concession to the Trump administration, Mayor Bowser said, and I quote, "We have bigger fish to fry." I raise this example in full recognition of the host of critiques of the mural, including the aestheticization of Black Lives Matter, rather than the production of meaningful structural change. But I also see in that mural, as a New York Times reporter noted, quote, "a stamp of protest on a place where powerful people lived, worked, and commuted." It's a stamp of protest that has been erased. We have also seen institutions, including universities, removing so-called trigger words from their websites, purging pages of terms like diverse students, vulnerable, systemic racism, and marginalized, or replacing those terms with others like equal opportunity and equal access in a form of preemptive compliance and risk averseness that, it seems, institutions think will spare them federal investigations, funding cuts, or worse. And some of this erasure, of course, is official, the result of explicit governmental mandate. 4 days ago, Arlington National Cemetery's website highlighting the graves of Black and female service members was removed as part of the ongoing purge of governmental websites devoted to something the right has identified as diversity and inclusion. I should note here the other erasures, and there are so many, that have happened in the past few months. The removal of the CDC's web pages on STDs and vaccine guidelines for pregnant people, presumably the phrase pregnant people was flagged. The 3,000 websites from the Census Bureau, the 1,000 websites from the Office of Justice, including a feature on teen dating violence, the 200 websites from Head Start, the 180 websites from the Department of Justice, including all state-level hate crime data, and the 8 pages from the Department of the Interior on environmental policy, presumably because the phrase environmental justice was used. It is worth noting, even though it is so plainly obvious, not just the deathly consequences of these erasures, but also the swift nature of destruction. We are only 2 months into an administration that has undone, unraveled, obliterated, and erased decades of intellectual work. The work of making something, as those of us in this room knows, takes decades. The work of destruction is fast. And of course, everyone in this room knows this, we gather in a moment when the university is being gutted, where it faces what Lee Bollinger calls, and I quote, an incredibly unprecedented and dangerous situation, an existential threat. In the face of this threat, or to be more accurate, threats in the plural, we see, in my mind, far too little in the way of courageous leadership, speaking back, or speaking up, or speaking against the swift dismantling of our institution. We hear far too few voices speaking in support of the work that our fields do, or in support of the project of academic excellence as equity, or in support of a vision of academic freedom that includes rigorous, uncomfortable disagreement and dissent. And we continue to see no sustained defense of the humanities. Indeed, when the humanities are gestured towards, it is as a form of inquiry that produces well-rounded citizens, as in computer programmers are better humans if they take an English class. Nowhere do we hear a sustained and amplified defense of the humanities as the space that allows us to explore enduring questions around ethics, equality, justice, freedom, questions that are utterly central to the political moment we find ourselves in. Instead, at least from where I sit, there is mostly the deafening sound of silence and quiet signs of compliance. I think of June Jordan reminding us, and some of us did not die, quote, I am always hoping to do better than to collaborate with whatever or whomever it is that means me no good. I should say I still can't shake the feeling, the foolish hope, I suppose, that our institutions would do better than to collaborate with the forces that seek to kill us. These multiple intersecting crises have, of course, material effects on the kinds of work we do, how we fund our research and our graduate students, how we fund and support our conferences and our gatherings, how we support our undergraduate students who are often in our classes learning how to form and voice the questions that become sustained research projects. Indeed, our feminist academic ecosystem requires not just gender and sexuality studies departments and programs, but also feminist and queer academic journals, scholarly conferences, and university presses, all of which enable the production and circulation of knowledge in our field, all of which are crucial if we want our disciplines to live on. The crises that I name here have left many of my colleagues in a state of fear and anxiety. Every day someone sends me a message, or truth be told, sometimes I send the message. What are we gonna do? How are we gonna survive? Are we gonna survive? To be clear, there is nothing hyperbolic in these questions. They are animated by a brutal truth that we must contend with. We are faced with an organized and well-resourced set of forces that have collaborated to destroy us. Last year, at this very gathering, I talked about the incredible success of our field. I noted that we were in the era of anniversaries. Feminist Studies and Signs, 2 leading journals in our field, had celebrated their 50th anniversaries. Our own program, GSF at Duke, had celebrated its 40th anniversary in 2023. The proliferation of anniversaries and celebrations, I noted then, was evidence of the fact that gender and sexuality studies has forged institutional homes, fought and won space in the university, even as that space is allocated, inhabited, and felt differently across institutions, across the public-private binary, across the US and globally. It is no doubt, I said last year, our institutionalization, admittedly uneven, ambivalent, and complex, that has generated the ire that emerges from the right. But today, I'm struck by how quickly we can be erased despite decades of intellectual labor, despite having fought for and gained a foothold in the institution. Every day offers new evidence of the swift dismantling of feminist institutions. This year would have been the 50th Annual Scholar and Feminist Conference at Barnard College. For those of us who are students of feminist history, Scholar and Feminist is probably most famous, or infamous, for its place in the feminist sex wars. It is, as we know in this room, a space where an affectively saturated and intensely polarized political debate about pornography and S&M and sex work played out. It was also a space where the fight over feminist censorship played out. It was at Scholar and Feminist that Gail Rubin warned audience members in the talk that would become Thinking Sex that, quote, "It is precisely at times such as these, when we live with the possibility of unthinkable destruction, that people are likely to become dangerously crazy about sexuality." She went on, "Sexuality should be treated with special respect in times of great social stress." Wise words. This year, Scholar and Feminist Conference was to be a 50th anniversary celebration centered on academic freedom. No doubt a timely topic. When Pramila Nadasen resigned from her position as director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women in December, she announced the cancellation of the conference, noting, quote, "We have decided not to hold the conference this spring, rather than attempt to celebrate the 50th anniversary with an event that could at best be a shadow of itself." She went on, "Unfortunately, the situation at Barnard is one where surveillance and control has taken precedence over everything else, including teaching and learning." I name this loss, the loss of Scholar and Feminist Conference, the uncertainty as to whether it will return, the lack of this anniversary celebration, to publicly mourn the death of spaces for feminists to think in public. In November, when UC Santa Cruz's Feminist Studies Department turned 50, it announced its de-departmentalization. The department traces its origins to a program established in 1974 in women's studies. It later earned department status in 1996 and became the first in the country to change its name to Feminist Studies in 2005. In a statement published on their website, the department promised that, quote, "Feminist Studies will always have a home at UCSC. But the current departmental formation has proven unsustainable and inadequate for providing a responsive space for intellectual exchange and connection on our campus," end quote. Well, this decision, like the one to cancel the 50th Scholar and Feminist, like so many institutional shifts, is marked by the idiosyncrasies and politics and personalities and institutional arrangements of its particular place. I name this loss also as an unbearable one in this moment. Here, I am marking not just my political disappointment, to borrow Sarah Marcus's phrase, at the loss of spaces of feminist knowledge production. I am also marking my own feminist grief, one that is intensified by my location here in an institution that simply keeps going on, as if the world is not crumbling around us. By naming a kind of feminist grief, I want to mark that while the conditions we find ourselves in are not unexpected, I am certainly not surprised by the deathly commitments of the current administration. I am surprised by how bad it feels. It is feminist grief I feel when the New York Times compiles a list of words that have been flagged by the Trump administration, words that are to be avoided, purged, erased in the national war against wokeism. Activists, affirming care, diversity, inclusive, race, gender, inequity, intersectionality, LGBTQ exclusion. And while I have spent much of my academic career thinking with and at times against some of these terms, tracing their genealogies and interrogating how, why, and when they have become sites of feminist engagement, I mourn the ways that they have been slated for erasure. I mourn the fact that I can no longer apply for any federal grant using any of the words I would ordinarily deploy to describe my work. I mourn the fact that the spaces I seek to build within the institution for scholarly work I deem important have been marked for death. It is feminist grief I feel when I end my sentences with maybe we'll be here next year, marking the tentative and precarious nature of everything related to our field now. So there is only one question that has guided me in the last few weeks, which when I reread Christina Sharp's ordinary notes for my class, some of my students are here, so shout out to my students. I was returned to the importance of this question. Sharp asks us, what is required of us now in this long time of our undoing? What I have enjoyed about this gathering for so many years is that we meet without an organizing theme or structure. But my hope this year is that we can have our eyes firmly set on the uneven, precarious, dangerous, deadly ground on which we meet. My hope is we can be animated by a desire to think of what is required for us as this world attempts to undo us. That we can be firmly oriented toward not just the necessity of feminist theories to explain the drives, deathly fantasies, and chaotic impulses that undergird this moment, but also the urgency of honing and sharpening feminist theoretical tools that can help us explain the configurations of power we see wielded now. One thing that is required of us, I think, is the work of study, particularly collective study. And my hope is that these 2 days offer us the opportunity, again, increasingly rare, to think together in public about forging feminist theories in and for a time of emergency. I start by naming grief because that is the place from which I speak, or at least it's part of the place from which I speak. There is also, I should note, a deep, fundamentally Black feminist, asymmetrical, abundant rage. What Patricia Williams calls intelligent rage, what Brittany Cooper called eloquent rage. It is a rage that is sharpened every day. I find myself thinking again with June Jordan's essay, Some of Us Did Not Die, where Jordan insists, and I quote, "Some of us did not die. Some of you, some of us remain. Despite that hatred, that violence, that murder, that suicide, that affront to our notions of civilized days and nights." And she continues, "And what shall we do, we who did not die? What shall we do now? How shall we grieve and cry out loud and face down despair? Is there an honorable nonviolent means toward mourning and remembering who and what we loved? This," she tells us, "will take study and it will take time." I see this weekend as an important opportunity for us to take study and to take time together in the increasingly rare sight of feminist gathering. So I want to conclude with a few requests and perhaps most importantly, some notes of gratitude. So the requests. We have a very full room here and virtually, and many, many folks will want to ask questions after talks. Our wonderful moderators, Barbara, the Barbaras in the back, will do their best to get to as many questions as possible. I ask that you offer them your patience and your grace as we navigate a full room and the time required to move the microphones around. Which reminds me, please make sure to wait until you have the microphone so everyone in the room can hear you and everyone on Zoom can hear you. Please wear your badges at all times as you come in and out of Penn Pavilion. You'll need it to get in the door. And for the graduate students in the room, you will need it to get your beers tomorrow night at the gathering. And for those of you who are interested, I wanted to make a plug for the Rubenstein Library's fabulous exhibition, An Open Mesh of Possibilities, Thinking Queerness with Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's archive. I know some of you in this room went to see it earlier today. The exhibition's open from 9 to 5 today and 1 to 5 tomorrow. The Rubenstein is a short, very beautiful walk from here, and any of us from Duke are happy to guide you toward the exhibition. I want to conclude with some words of gratitude. It takes, every year I write a lot of work and I cross it out and I'm like, so much work to sustain an event of this scale every year. So I want to thank the GSF directors before me, Robin Wiegman, Ranji Khanna, Priscilla Wald, and Jolie Alcott, all of whom have played a tremendous role in the vitality of this gathering and who had the energy to keep it going every year. I especially want to thank Robin for having the vision to start Feminist Theory Workshop. You can find the long list of FTW co-sponsors in your program. I want to thank the many departments here at Duke and at other institutions that have long been friends of our workshop. And I want to thank the Trinity College Dean's Office for their support as well. Everything you see in this room, from the name tags to the photo booth to the cups to the beautiful arrangements of everything, seems effortless, but is actually the result of the tremendous and tireless labor of our all-star staff. So I want to offer endless thanks to Jeremy Boomhauer, Amanda Archambault, and Kayla McManus-Vienna for a year of planning and organizing and emailing again, all while maintaining a sense of humor and a necessary attention to March Madness scores. This trio's attention to every detail, big and small, makes these 2 days possible. And I want to thank Lauren Henschel, who is not here today, and Tanya Rispoli in the back for a year's worth of meetings to ensure that today's event, both in person and virtual, is seamless, and for their continued commitment to the event. And I want to thank our GSF student workers, Ashaka Desai, Zara Thalji, and Chitali Alanis, and our graduate student workers, or I think conference interns, for helping everything run smoothly. The two folks who I lovingly call the Barbaras, Barbara Hala and Barbara Ofusu Samwa, thank you. And Joe Hiller, thank you for volunteering to lead a great tour of the Sedgwick today. And finally, I want to thank the faculty, my colleagues in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies here. Every year, this conference is a team effort. It requires us to show up for each other. And I want to thank the core faculty, Frances Hasso, Kimberly Lamb, Nikki Lane, Gabe Rosenberg, Anna Storty, Nikki Washington, Kathy Weeks, and Ara Wilson for their work and commitment. And I want to thank our secondary faculty, which is a robust list of folks who show up for us consistently, support our work, and participate in our intellectual community. And now, it is my joy to say, let's begin. So I would like to turn over the podium to my extraordinary colleague and friend, Jasmine Cobb, who is Professor of African and African American Studies and Art History, and Visual Studies here at Duke. Thank you.
Hello. I have a purpose, but before I get to that, I think we should all take a moment and thank Jennifer Nash for honesty and courage at a moment like this. I presume there's no crying at the Feminist Theory Workshop, and so I will keep this together. But I really am thrilled to introduce Nicole Fleetwood, the Paulette Goddard Professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication, in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. Fleetwood is a writer, curator, and art critic interested in Black art and cultural history, aesthetics, photography, and documentary studies, and art and activism. You may know her earlier works on racial icons, Blackness and public imagination, as well as Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, which is demarcated by the 2012 Laura Ramiro First Book Publication Prize of the American Studies Association. Her body of work is required reading for the study of Black visual culture. In these earlier texts, Fleetwood lays out Blackness as a troubling vision, where the visible Black body poses an enduring nuisance to the very scopic regimes that rendered it problematic, and locates this foundation in captivity and capitalism. Forcing us to rethink the casual citation of canonic theorists like Frantz Fanon, Fleetwood offers the Black woman's body as the bearer of its own look, deftly aware of hostile gazes. Her body of work calls together so-called fine art, everyday life, and creativity, the reception of each shaped by conceptions of gender and Blackness, and making way for her path-breaking book, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, which is the winner of the National Book Critics Award in Criticism, the John Hope Franklin Publication Prize of the American Studies Association, the Susan M. Glasscock Humanities Book Prize for Interdisciplinary Scholarship, and both the Charles Rufus Morey Book Award in Art History and the Frank Jewett Mather Award in Art Criticism. Marking Time, quote, is about the centrality of prisons to contemporary art and culture and the robust world-making inside U.S. prisons. It emphasizes the aesthetic engagement and knowledge worlds of people largely excluded from civic life, art establishments, and public culture, in part by exploring art by incarcerated people. Marking Time requires that we expand beyond the question of can art happen in prisons, to instead see countless artists remain incarcerated and to sit with that discomfort. She curated the traveling exhibition Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, which debuted at MoMA PS1 and was listed as one of the most important art moments in 2020 by the New York Times and among the best shows of the year by the New Yorker and Hyperallergic. She also co-edited Aperture Magazine's Prison Nation issue, which focuses on photography's role in documenting mass incarceration. Her work in this area has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the Art for Justice Fund, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture, just to name a few. I had the pleasure of watching the creation of Marking Time as a work in progress through a presentation at Northwestern University back around 2012. The magnificence of this work and the majesty of Fleetwood as a scholar is in her insistence to see all of life, including the people and places we know outside of the academy, as sites of knowledge production, and then to insist on showing that to the world. I know she will do that in her forthcoming book, Between the River and Railroad Tracks, published by Little Brown, and I know she will do it today. I am happy to present a true genius and a sister, Nicole Fleetwood.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I remember when I met you as a graduate student, and we became friends immediately. And so, I think the joy of being in feminist spaces for me is actually the friendships that I have made that have blessed me over my time in the university. And there have been many times when I've doubted if I chose the right thing. But then when I see Jasmine or Farah or Jen, I know that I'm where I'm supposed to be. So thank you very much. So good afternoon. It is wonderful to be here with friends like Jen and Jasmine and Farah, and to see so many people who I don't know, but whose work I deeply admire. And I mean that with gratitude. I believe in sacred gathering. And my talk today is actually thinking through four mothers, and that being literally my mother and my maternal grandmother, and then like my feminist foremothers. And not saying this explicitly, but as I was working on preparing today, realizing that the lessons sometimes overlap, but they're often very different. And there's tension for me in the way I live my life and in my writing with these very different kind of lessons. And one coming from my very conservative, pious grandmother who is my muse, and who imprinted on me like no one else. But her lesson, in many ways, I wouldn't say it's anti-feminist, but it's a different kind of register. And so I'm here to represent those frictions and to also think about those spaces where we learn lessons that carry us that might actually rub up against how we self-identify in the world. And I say that because I realized when I started talking about this project, Between the River and the Railroad Tracks, when I was talking about it anecdotally, I would tell people about my grandmother. And anyone who knows me more than like 5 seconds know that like I'm the biggest grandmother's girl on the planet. I talk about my grandmother every day. My grandmother died on March 29th, 2009. She is with me. She remains with me. But I used to say things like, my grandmother taught me what hermeneutics is. My grandmother was an interpreter of the Bible. And then I'd say, but I'm not religious like her. And I'm like, why am I disavowing my grandmother's religion? And it's something about academic spaces that make me feel like I have to disavow that. And so I'm refuting that. I'm claiming my grandmother's religiosity and all that she brought into my life because of her religiosity, and holding space for that. And I'm hoping we can talk more about that during Q&A. But I want to just say it's an honor to be here with and to be a keynote speaker among Sophie Lewis, Linda Zerilli, and Farah, whose work I deeply admire. Farah Jasmine Griffin. We were here 10 years ago at Duke, and this is the last time we saw each other. We were keynoting an event, so thank you, Duke, for bringing us together. And we live a couple of miles, we both live in New York City. So thank you, Duke, for making this possible again. And, just thank you for the generosity of Jen and of everyone who's made this workshop possible. in this workshop, I understand it's the 18th anniversary of it. And I want to say that when it started, I wasn't aware of it, but I could have truly benefited from it. And so it's great to have grad students and postdocs here. My first experience with anything that was like a feminist workshop space would have been as an undergrad. I was in a very hippie, liberal, interdisciplinary studies program in Southwest Ohio. And so, and it did plant the seeds for what's possible when communities like this are formed and when we, really hold space for each other. But it was when I was a postdoc fellow at Vassar College that I was invited to participate at the Institute for Research on Women at Rutgers in a multi-generational feminist workshop space. And I do believe that we really need to make sure that in this moment, more so than any, that we are speaking transgenerationally. I developed lifelong friends there. I ended up working at Rutgers as a result of that feminist workshop space, and then being the first Black director of that institute that brought me in for that workshop. So I think that these spaces are so important for many reasons. And I want to say I spent the past 3 days just reading up on the history of radical workshops. I'm not going to talk to you about that, but when a word gets logged into my brain, I'm like, that's how my brain works. I just start obsessing with it. But what I want to say is that the workshop as a framework is one that has always inspired me. And in the spirit of the feminist workshop space that brings us together, I want to share a book that I am working on right now that actually started in a workshop in 2009. It was a creative nonfiction workshop space ran by the late writer Hetty Jones, who is the mother of esteemed art historian Dr. Kelly Jones, and writer and my close friend Lisa Jones Brown. Every week, our group of 9 people showed up with 3 pages and read those pages aloud. We set the timer for feedback, and then we moved on to the next workshop member. Over the course of several weeks of doing this, I noticed that I was not writing about my life in New York, not writing about my life as an adult at all. Instead, everything I wrote was about the small Black community in Southwest Ohio that had nurtured and raised me. It is a place in a city called Hamilton, Ohio, that is described as the demographic averages of the U.S. It was for many decades. Now it's considered older and wider than the demographic averages. So the writing felt like tinkering, like I was tinkering. A paragraph here, a scene from the community center where my cousins and I spent our summers and after-school hours. My first conscious spiritual encounter. The workshop has shaped my writing process since then. Those works, and this idea that the work will become what it needs to become. I see the workshop space as a space that emphasizes process over production. But all those bits and pieces have amassed over 15 years now to about 70,000 words that I'm currently editing for a release date of next year. And what I'm sharing with you is some raw excerpts from the edits that I'm trying to get done by April 15th. But much of the book orbits around my maternal grandmother, Barbara Jean Fleetwood, who imprinted on me at an early age a reverence of nature, breezes, bird songs, and seasonal change, a devotion to the immaterial, a seeking for spiritual connection. She remains my guide. My grandmother was a pious woman who wore skirts past her calves, closed-toed shoes, and covered her arms in public. In some respects, she was deeply conservative, a leader in the Holiness Church where she worshiped her adult life. And in many ways, she was also deeply creative, imaginative, and playful. And so I want to bring all those things to this space. She imprinted on me a blueprint for living, a practice of beloved community, a deep reverence for living and embodiment, a cultivation of Black women's expressive capacities, especially through music. I feel like most importantly, she taught me how to sit with myself. Can you play the video now? This is one of my grandmother's last performances before she died. I think they're going to play it again because you're supposed to be able to see her. Thank you. You can turn to the slides now. Thank you. So, and how's the volume is okay? Okay. So in thinking about my grandmother and this gathering, the Feminist Theory Workshop space, I also went back to the origins of the kitchen table press, a collective formed out of a need articulated by Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith to create an outlet for the cultivation and publications of voices and writings by women of color. And I just want to read briefly from Barbara Smith in her essay, A Press of Our Own, the Kitchen Table. Since the early 1970s, a small but devoted group of feminist activists, teachers, and writers, many of them Black women, have been working to make visible the writing, culture, and history of women of color. It was their work, not Madison Avenue's, that laid the political and ideological groundwork for the Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, and also for the current 80s renaissance of writing by Black and other women of color. Starting a press for women of color in 1980 may have defied logic, but it was one of those acts of courage that characterized third world women's lives. In October 1980, Audre Lorde said to me during a phone conversation, "We really need to do something about publishing." We did not arrive at a name or announce our existence until a year later, but at that initial meeting, we did decide to publish all women of color, although there were only women of African American and African Caribbean descent in the room. This was one of our bravest steps. Most people of color have chosen to work in their separate groups when they do media or other projects. We were saying that as women, feminists, and lesbians of color, we had experiences and work to do in common, although we also had our differences. On the most basic level, Kitchen Table Press began because of our need for autonomy, our need to determine independently both the content and the conditions of our work, and to control the words and images that were produced about us. As feminist and lesbian of color writers, we knew that we had no options for getting published except at the mercy or whim of others in either commercial or alternative publishing, since both are dominated by whites. We have considered Kitchen Table to be both an activist and a literary publisher. We are committed to producing work of high artistic quality that simultaneously contributes to the liberation of women of color and all people. We publish a work not simply because it is by a woman of color, but because it consciously examines from a positive and original perspective the specific situations and issues that women of color face. So I want to invoke the kitchen table as press and as space of theorizing and workshopping for Black women historically and in the present, as I saw my grandmother and my mother world envisioning, interpreting, and problem solving on the ground level, day in and day out. Between the River and the Railroad Tracks, the title of my current book fits more into the capacious genre of creative nonfiction than conventional scholarship. It is a memoir and a story of place about the Black community in Hamilton, Ohio, my hometown, a town in southwest Ohio that has been described as the most average American city. It is structured through a series of vignettes set mainly in the Second Ward, where most Black residents lived in the 20th century. When I was growing up in the 1980s, the town was comprised largely of working-class whites with a small Black population, about 10% of the city, and a ruling elite of whites who were descendants of some of the first white settlers. I am a fourth-generation Black Hamiltonian by some accounts, a seventh generation by other accounts. The book takes place between the late 70s and late 80s and weaves exterior and interior scenes of the life of the Second Ward, organized around the streets, childhood and family memories, and profiles of neighborhood residents. The narratives unfold through first-person storytelling by me, a cautious but curious child, a young Black girl observing the flow of life from within our community before it is disrupted by the closing of factories and mills, the decline of labor unions, the rise in political and religious conservatism, and the street drug economy that wreaked havoc on the community. The vignettes deal with issues of safety and belonging regulated by psychic and social boundaries that I do not fully understand but learn to embody. What haunts all the vignettes is the threat of my father, a talented musician, a once promising college student, and a young man struggling with mental illness and addiction who stalks my mother and me as we move from place to place in the Second Ward, looking for safety within this small community. Here, memory, crucial and incomplete, intersect with place and family stories. I do not try to disentangle them, but instead reveal how they accumulate and shape my habits, imagination, sense of self, and understanding of the world around me. Remembering is a form of mapping my childhood community, a community that no longer exists. That's my grandma in her kitchen. Music is also a central component. My grandmother was the choir director of her church for half a century. She raised her children to be musicians as well. My uncle and older cousins formed the funk band Zap, featuring Roger Troutman in her basement, and went on to influence hip-hop, especially the G-Funk era. Their music is reflective of the atmosphere, aesthetics, and labor practices of the region in the era. This long and steady glance at the Black Midwest, its aesthetic, its geography and soil, its labor and political economy, its spirit, is part of a growing interest in the particularities of Black history, culture, and social formation in the Midwest, especially during the late 19th and early 20th century, with projects like the Black Midwest Initiative housed at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and founded by scholar Terry Williamson. So I want to nod to that work. So I'm just going to read some excerpts from the project. Hamilton, Ohio exists in the shadows of Cincinnati, its neighbor to the southeast. Whereas Cincinnati has been tagged the Queen City, Hamilton's nickname is Hamiltucky because of its sizable population of poor white Appalachian residents. Cincinnati is set upon 7 illustrious hills with stately manners running along the Ohio River, while Hamilton's landscape is scarred by railroad tracks, modest shotgun homes, and the Great Miami River, which once supported dozens of factories, but now overflows with runoff from nearby toxic waste dumps. In an earlier era, Hamilton, Ohio, was a place where poor Black migrants from Alabama and Georgia and poor white migrants from Kentucky and West Virginia came to find jobs in paper mills, textile plants, steel mills, and later automobile factories. In Hamilton, we were proud of making stuff: metal beams, stationery, mechanical parts, tires, and vaults. A sign marking the city limits once read, "Welcome to Hamilton, the safety lock capital of the world," referring to Moser's Safe Company, based there for over a century before it went bankrupt in 2001. When I was a child, journalist Peter Davis published a study of Hamilton called Hometown, A Portrait of an American Community in 1982, based on his 2 years of ethnographic research. Davis, after consulting the Census Bureau, chose to study Hamilton because of how it represented so many demographic averages. It was the quintessential American town, he wrote, quote, "Places like Hamilton are variously called the nation's heartbeat, in the middle of nowhere, incubators and stagnant pools. Depending on how it's observed, Hamilton is a city, a self-contained town, a suburb, a satellite in the orbits of both Cincinnati and Dayton, a minor metropolitan cluster, a county seat, a bump on the plane, a galactic microdot where 63,189 wait to see what will happen next. And so the population has remained around that number. Shortly after the book came out, city officials hired a big city advertising firm to develop a promotional campaign that would capitalize on Hamilton's distinct features of being average. Inspired by the musical Oklahoma, the firm suggested that Hamilton brand itself with an exclamation point. In 1986, the city officially became Hamilton, exclamation point, Ohio, away with the comma that separated municipality from statehood. Hamilton was a statement unto itself. We celebrated its renaming at Hamilton's 4th of July celebration, an annual summer event on the downtown corridor where Front Street and High Street intersected. Dressed in red, white, and blue, residents converged in front of the great courthouse. It was during one of these annual celebrations, 8 years earlier, when I was 5, filled with civic pride and a mouthful of seeds, grinned for cameras of the local newspaper, having won my very first award, a prize in the city's annual watermelon eating contest. I sat on benches with other little kids whose families were descendants of Black sharecroppers and white miners. We were all sticky and giddy from attention and applause. Every year at the annual celebration, town residents let out boisterous cheers and hoots as the official announcement that once again the city had won, and this is true, the best tasting tap water in the state, a designation that the local government attempted to market as a tourist attraction. The city had also won awards for best tasting tap water in the country and the world, of which we were very proud. But this year was epic. We had attracted national media with the city's bold renaming. It was in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Residents and shop owners enjoyed the extra attention, even if it meant many of the newspapers were there to report us as the butt of a national joke. A parade formed along High Street, just a few yards from where, in 1791, General Arthur St. Clair, appointed governor of the Northwest Territory, established Fort Hamilton, naming it after statesman Alexander Hamilton as a marker of European invasion into indigenous territory. In 1803, Hamilton became a town on the western frontier of a settler colonial nation state whose wealth was booming from land extraction and captive labor. Ignorant of these local and national histories, but knowing racism as a palpable thing, I marched as part of the cheerleading squad of George Washington Junior High School, swinging our arms and stomping in unison as we spelled the city's names with our movements, the crowd shouting the letters alongside us. I was one of 2 Black girls on the squad that year, the other being my friend Janice Henderson. The coaches never choreographed routines where she and I stood next to each other. We were careful, even if not conscious of it, to avoid the impression of 2 Black people marching together in solidarity through the center of town. Somewhere in the crowd were my mother, grandmother, and little brother Craig, cheering me on with my cousins and aunts. "Go, Nikki," they yelled as I passed them. I saw my grandmother first. She stood only 4'10" and looked even smaller as she held her purse close to her chest and locked arms with my mom. She hated crowds. A couple of blocks south of High Street, where the renaming ceremony took place, was the Second Ward, separated from the city center by railroad tracks. The Second Ward had once been the southern edge of town, bordered by Knightsbridge Avenue. Even as the town grew further south and east, the Second Ward still felt like the edge of town, where we existed separate from the rest of the city. When my mother was at work, I roamed the Second Ward with my cousins, Eric, Cassandra, Rhonda, and Alan. We were 2 years apart. I was the oldest and Alan the youngest. In between were Eric, Cassandra, and Rhonda in that order. Today is Rhonda's birthday. Happy birthday, Rhonda. Eric and Rhonda were siblings, so were Cassandra and Alan. Back then, I was an only child. Our world did not extend far beyond our grandparents' home on Beckett Street, where they had raised 11 children. Their children spanned 20 years. Grandma gave birth to 2 sets of twins, I should say, in that, would go on to raise several of her grandchildren and even her great-grandchildren there. Though it was technically our grandparents' home, we all called it Grandma's. She was always there. Grandpa worked long hours at Armco Steel Mill and spent the rest of his time fishing or at the L&K bar. Beckett Street was named after the Beckett paper mill, one of the mills that had built the town. Beckett's motto, maker of good paper in Hamilton, Ohio, since 1848. It's hard to imagine that someone other than Grandma had once occupied 160 Beckett Street. That's my grandma and grandpa right there. Coming up, in this, I think the next slide. Yeah, right there, with their oldest daughter. In their house on Beckett Street. For 5 decades, it was her domain, and everyone who knew her knew where to find her. People who had disappeared from our lives would show up years later and knock on the door. Is Mrs. Fleetwood there? Remember me? I went to school with your daughter, Sharon. Distant relatives and friends of friends passing through Hamilton on their way across country would stop by and have a cold drink on the porch before continuing on their journey. Sometimes people would show up because they wanted Grandma to pray for them. But 160 Street had been home to others before the Fleetwoods renamed it Grandma's House or 1 Beckett. The first dwelling recorded on the parcel of land that would become Beckett Street is a single frame house and barn in the 1850s. Between 1902 and 1906, a home is built and 160 Beckett Street becomes a geographic marker, an address, a place in the county records. Before townspeople can say with familiarity, oh, you know the Fleetwoods who live on Beckett Street, there are others who live there. They are makers of things, a machinist, a motor, a core maker, a paper worker, a laborer. 1904 to 1908, John L. Gradoff, machinist, proprietor, spouse, Minnie K. Gradoff. 1910 to 1926, William E. Conrad, motor, spouse, Mary A. Conrad. 1917 to 1926, again, William E. Conrad, motor, spouse, Mary Conrad. 1927 to 1947, Frank M. Mouse, core maker, spouse, Loretta Mouse. 1949 to 1957, Martin B. Mick, paper worker, Champion Paper and Fiber Company, spouse, Audrey Mick. 1958, Willis D. Cothran, laborer, Best Furniture, spouse, Charlotte Cothran. In 1960, new residents, a Black family with several young children, move into the home. Sherman Fleetwood, worker, Armco, spouse, Barbara L. Fleetwood. Grandpa and Grandma are 31. Grandpa has a high school diploma. Grandma has an 8th grade education, and they are homeowners in a red-line neighborhood. That enormous achievement, as modest as it sounds, creates a level of stability for all of their offspring and the generations to come. By the 1970s, Beckett Street is made up of other large intergenerational Black families who, like us, lived in almost identical homes, narrow 2-story structures called L houses, a vernacular style of architecture popular in mill towns in the region, where one room opened onto the other and the floors stacked on top of each other like Lego bricks. Down the street were the Sears, the Goodwins, and the Knights. On surrounding blocks lived the Kimballs, the Nils, the Shaziers, the Rosses, and the Thompsons. Their parents had grown up with our parents, and many of their grandparents were children and friends of our grandparents, or childhood friends of our grandparents. At home, Grandma spent most of her time in the kitchen. At church, she spent most of her time at the organ. At dawn, she whistled and hummed along with the birds in her backyard. At dusk, she rested, sitting on the porch, enjoying a cool breeze, or in the living room in her recliner. Thank you, Jesus. God is so good. Everyone is asleep, except for the 2 of us. I sit across from Grandma at the kitchen table. It is early. She's been up for a while. Lying in bed before I came downstairs between my cousin Rhonda and my Aunt Sheila, I am awake, listening for Grandma to rise in the quiet dark. Knowing she likes to be alone first thing in the morning, I wait until the kettle has whistled, the toilet flushed, the oven door has opened and closed, and then I come down. The kitchen smells like sugared coffee and buttered bread. She is repeating a Bible verse to memory, storing it for later. Grandma stands next to the stove. My head rests on the table as she makes me toast. In a high-pitched voice, she sings a funny song from her childhood. She knows I love when she does it. Turkey in the straw. I can't sing at all. Turkey in the straw. Roll 'em up and twist 'em up a high tuck-a-haul and hit 'em with a tune called a turkey in the straw. Followed by funny animal sounds, a minstrel song I'd learned decades later. Sleepy-eyed, listening to her croak, I'm smiling as she layers grape jelly onto my toast. Behind me, the washing machine gyrates, and the rhythm is soothing. Later, Grandma will hang out laundry, stretching them between the apple tree and willow tree out back. Grandma talks sparingly, but sings throughout the day. She is a walking catalog of hymns, gospel music, blues tunes, folk songs, work songs, nursery rhymes, a catalog rooted in her family's history of slavery and sharecropping in Alabama. Her mother, Edna Matthews, was born in 1904 in Wetumpka, one of several children. The exact number is debated by family and historical record, but we approximate about 20 children. At the time, Wetumpka was a tiny town of under 1,000 people in the rural county of Elmore, but the county had made its mark, appearing in newspapers and publications around the nation for its spectacular acts of lynching. In 1897, 4 black men were lynched together in town: Solomon Jackson, Louis Spear, Jesse Thompson, and Camp Reeves. Winfred Townsend was burned at stake in 1900. 15 miles away from Wetumpka. Many others died similarly, and many lived under racial terror, brutal labor conditions, and destitute poverty. In the early 1900s, Wetumpka was a place that many black residents sought to escape. Anna followed her older siblings north to Ohio in the early 20th century. Not long after she arrived in Hamilton, she had placed an advertisement in a local paper offering her services as a cleaning woman. Later, she would teach her children to sing and clean. Edna and her siblings were hoping to find opportunities in the North, but there were also cross burnings and lynchings in Ohio too, they would come to learn. The jobs were better, but the conditions were hard. The winters were cold, and they were forced into cramped quarters on narrow streets heavily patrolled by paddy wagons and racist officers. The Matthews siblings settled in part of the second ward called the Jungles because of its concentration of black residents, cheap housing, saloons, and brothels. Not long after her arrival, Edna met another recent transplant from the South, Sylvester Trotman. Their second daughter, Barbara Jean Trotman, was born in the Jungles on November 29, 1929. In the early days of the Great Depression, the family and community struggled mightily. By the 1950s, the black population had spread south and east of High Street, all along Front Street to the thoroughfare of Knightsbridge. Grandma never liked her name, and as soon as she got grown, she changed it from Bobby Jean Trotman to Barbara Jean Trotman. A couple years later, and for the rest of her life, it would be Barbara Jean Fleetwood. She would become associated with all that was good about the Fleetwood name in Hamilton, Ohio, but she would read the paper daily, keeping track of all the ways our names were linked to the city's problems. For years, like her mother, my grandmother worked as a maid, but her calling was sacred music. She sang to God all day long. Blessed Assurance, one of her favorite hymns, was written by Fanny Crosby, a blind woman in the late 1800s, who over the course of her life wrote thousands of hymns by dictating songs in her head to a pianist friend. My grandmother, again, was the choir director of Mount Ebo Church, and she not only was a pianist, but she couldn't read music until she retired in her 60s and studied music. For most of her life, she played everything by ear and experience. She would listen to someone sing a few lines of a song and accompany them with her eyes closed, like she knew the music by heart. The family story is that when Grandma was a teenager, she was far from pious. She was popular in the Second War because of her curves and her quiet mystique. She hung out in mixed company, smoked cigarettes, and danced at juke joints. But when she was 19, she went to a tent revival with her older sister. People gave spontaneous testimonies, and Black preachers from the region gave rousing sermons. Bobby Jean was overtaken by the Holy Spirit. Shortly thereafter, she received a divine visit. So this is an ice house, by the way, that was created by my great uncle in the early 1900s. And that's how he took care of his siblings and then his family once they came to Hamilton. So shortly after she went to that revival, my grandmother told the story that she received a divine visit from an angel who told her that she would be in service of God through music and caring for children for the rest of her life. I am pretty sure that Grandma knew nothing about Fanny Crosby, her blindness and musical journey, but blindness was Grandmother's favorite spiritual metaphor. She loved to tell the story of Saul struck blind by God on the road to Damascus and reborn as Paul. While making dinner or washing laundry, Grandma would make up melodies to lyrics like, "I once was blind, but now I see." The transformation from spiritual blindness to divine light was the most powerful way of expressing God's grace, she conveyed. I sensed as a child that Grandma's interior life was far, far away from us. Her singing was part of her inner monologue, and sometimes we got glimpses. She sang the melody and tapped out harmony on whatever surface was near her. She slowed down lines, repeated words, screeched revelations, and let her voice fall from a high pitch to a free-falling cascade. This is my story. This is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. In the third grade, I started writing love letters to God and sharing them with my Sunday school teacher. I wanted to understand my grandmother's spiritual devotion and how she found peace and calm in the chaos of our lives. Tell me, Grandma, what do you know about God and grace? Does God judge? Are prayers answered? Does God understand my fears? How did you, dear Granny, perform that miracle? Turning $2, coins you gather in pockets and corners of your purse, into enough to feed this growing brood. Who taught you to chant, "This too shall pass"? How you wield it like a potion. Grandma sits on the porch singing softly, "Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine." Hearing her sing, it was like listening to a secret. Cosby's music was one of the inspirations that Grandma brought to her role at the church. And then, I'm going to skip one, sorry. A little about the church. Mount Ebal was a small church house that Black community members all signed the deed on. And so I'm just also thinking about kind of collective land ownership and creating institutions in a community that's under-resourced. My grandfather was one of the signers of the deed, but it was a small church house whose congregants were made up of a few intergenerational families from the Second Ward. The kids pronounced it Mount Evil. I thought that name meant that the church was a mount to overcome evil. And for decades, it was led by Reverend Berger and his wife, Sister Berger, who styled herself after Coretta Scott King. The church stood at the corner of Front and Herm Streets, a crossing in the neighborhood where people aired their grievances, where the new homes sat across the street from the old projects, both housing projects. Up the road from the church was the police precinct that blared sirens as Reverend Berger called parishioners to repent. And directly across from the church was the L&K bar, where Grandpa spent most of his off work hours. Grandma and Grandpa were across the street from each other at their favorite establishments most nights of the week. Grandma would never enter a bar, and Grandpa would rarely enter a church. Many of the church congregants walked across the parking lot from the projects to the front doors of the church. There was a sign in front of the housing projects that read, Bamboo Harris Homes. The apartment complex was named after one of the first Black residents of Southwest Ohio. Most of us did not know that. I found this out during this through research. In 1795, Bamboo Harris, a free Black man, created the very first grist mill in Southwest Ohio in Butler County. Grist mills were necessary for settler colonialism. They allowed settlers to ground wheat and corn to make sustainable food sources. Harris is believed to have opened a second mill in 1836. He was not allowed to own his inventions. For a half century, though, he ran these mills, and it was what allowed largely white settler communities to establish themselves. A racism cloaked as honoring Black history would have it that the housing projects along Front Street would be named after him. And it was also a way of thinking about the kind of inventions and industrial infrastructure that led to this region of Ohio. From water-powered mills, the area converted to coal, mining Appalachia and other parts of the Southeast, and then building railroads to transport the fossil fuel from Kentucky to Ohio. Paper mills and steel mills and machinery shops that repaired the equipment in the mills employed most of the men in the area. Aunt Marion says that my great-grandfather, Sylvester Chapman, was the first Black man to retire from Black Clausen, which is a company founded in Hamilton in 1873. It was a machinery repair shop. And she emphasized that it was no small feat for a Black man to get a job and be able to survive long enough to retire. In addition to the dangers of the actual labor Black workers had to endure, their employment was quite hazardous, as it was not uncommon for white workers to push Black men into the fires, killing them. The mills and factories changed over time, mergers, closures, global conglomerates, but railroad tracks stayed the same. Grandma raised her family at Mount Ebo. 3 times a week, she walked her 9 daughters along the 5 blocks stretching between home and church. They were holy girls who wore long dresses that covered their knees and who spent much of their childhood and teen years in that small church house praising God, washing feet, passing notes, and receiving the Holy Spirit. But what they did most consistently was make music. Music that could be heard blocks away, and music that compelled the most down and out, wretched soul to occasionally peek his head in to see what was happening inside those walls. At Mount Ebo, we talked in tongues, we shouted, and we danced. Every Sunday, miracles took place. At any moment, someone could interrupt the sermon with, I just need to say that God is good, or I got to testify about how the Lord God delivered me from the hands of Lucifer, or I'm here to celebrate his name, Jesus. I say Jesus. On the Sundays when my mother and I visited Grandma's church, usually after attending our much quieter Baptist church, I sat on the edge of the pew to see who would be the first to interrupt Reverend Berger that day. One Sunday, Aunt Alyssa stood up in the middle of service with a deep guttural cry, Lord and Savior, you know my struggles, you know my trials and tribulations. I'm hurting, Lord, and only you can comfort me. She braced the pew with her hand, wobbly. Aunt Alyssa raised her arms up to the ceiling with open hands. Lord, I surrender, Lord, I surrender, I surrender, turn it all over to you. She stepped into the aisle and started hopping on one heel. She made her way to the front where Reverend Berger stood with a bottle in his hand. He anointed her with holy oil as she cried and cried. I was shaking. I had never seen an adult so overtaken by something I could not see. I love my grandmother's devotion. My mother followed her in a daily spiritual practice, and as a young child, I watched them with reverence. The 2 most powerful people in my life, both modest Black women, sitting at the kitchen table on Beckett Street, studying their Bibles every morning and night with a keen eye to detail and nuance, highlighting, underlining, annotating what they knew to be God's will for them. They believed in developing an intimacy with the text so that God would speak directly to their hearts. Meaning was there on those pages, and I wanted to experience the jubilation they felt reading. They taught me to be a lifelong learner and to develop a hermeneutical practice, reading everything slowly and with devotion, that truth to be revealed through interpretation. So my invocation, what I hope to happen in the next couple days, that this workshop is a site of genesis and tradition, of process and production, of ideation and collective making. May this be a space to connect intergenerationally, transgenerationally, ideas that have gestated in your imagination find words in community, where joy is theory and practice, where theory and spirituality are an intimate relation, where the walls come down, where the walls come down, where the walls come down. Thank you.